Good day, everyone. My name is Rowan. I'm the business manager at Munro Forensic Actuaries. Welcome to the second in our series of pod shots, and hopefully giving you a little bit more of an understanding of how actuaries work within the damages industry. Today, I'm going to be talking to two colleagues in the industry, one being Julie Valentini, who is the Chief Actuary at Munro Forensic Actuaries. Welcome, Julie. And then Dean Berndt, who heads up an interesting business called Spear Specialist Earnings, and they're going to be talking a little bit about their background and their qualifications, and they're going to help us with today's topic. And today we're going to be specifically discussing the importance of considering the claimant's employment sector when trying to understand the loss that the claimant is experiencing, and the importance of the industrial psychologist taking this employment sector into account in their report so that the actuary is able to properly assess the loss. And then we're going to look at the risks associated with the wrong sector being applied within the industrial psychologist report. And then we're going to also talk a little bit about how we can mitigate those risks. All right, so I want to start off by introducing Julie. As I said, she's our Chief Actuary at Munro Forensic Actuaries. Julie, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, specifically within the damages industry?
Yeah, sure. So I've been involved in the damages industry for about 12 years, part-time as well as more full-time in the last 5 years. My main focus has actually been on the product development within the business, so making sure that our reports are of a quality that our attorneys are happy with and as efficient as possible. So that's my main focus.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. I think you undersell yourself a little bit. So part of what we try to achieve in Munro is the use of technology extensively within all our operations. And so Julie has been at the forefront of designing and really quality assuring all our calculation engines that allows us to give an efficient service and obviously high quality reports with high degree of accuracy. And then we have Dean. As I said, Dean heads up Spear Specialist Earnings, which is an interesting business within the context of the damages industry. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Dean, your background, and then maybe just tell us a little bit about the business that you head up and how that operates within the damages industry?
Cool. Thanks, Rowan. You may fondly remember I've been involved in the industry since 2011, so quite some time now. Initially as an actuarial analyst, so got a good taste of what it was like doing the quantification part of the claim. And then since 2017, as you said, I've been involved with Spear Specialist Earnings as a business manager and a consultant. And we do industrial psychology reports as well as earnings expert reports. So very focused on the quantification part of claims.
And would it be fair to say that Spear Specialist Earnings is in that industrial psychologist space where you are sort of properly evaluating the claimant's earnings, the claimant's ability to earn, and the general stuff that industrial psychologists are involved in?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll mention the role as an industrial psychologist or IP synonymously with that of an earnings or employment expert, because it is quite nuanced in this the medical legal industry. The role that they fulfill in this industry is ultimately to provide, the actuary with a basis for their calculation.
All right, great. So let's jump in. As I said, today we're looking at the importance of considering the claimant's employment sector in assessing the loss. So Dean, maybe we can start with you, and let's start with trying to understand what is an employment sector and why is that important with respect to assessing the claimant's ultimate loss.
Yeah, so at a macro level, and quite specific to the medical legal industry, there are typically 4 categories that are used to describe the working population and the sectors they're in. So just referring to this diagram now, the first sector is in white, is the corporate sector, and that's the sector that covers companies or corporations that subscribe to earnings or corporate survey providers. So these are typically larger businesses with more resources and time, and they subscribe to the corporate providers, and they, in return, either pay for the services or provide their services with data. So these companies make up approximately 25% of the working population of the workforce.
And what would be a typical company that holds that data?
So you have a few of these service providers that are well known in the industry, one of which is Deloitte. You've got PE Corporate, which is now Willis Towers Watson. You've got 21st Century, and the Quantum Yearbook also provides their own sort of survey analysis. But these companies work in conjunction with the big corporations, and they gather and assimilate the data and the earnings.
Okay, go on. And the second sector?
So the second sector, which is in red, is the formal sector, and that represents all companies and all individuals that are formally registered. So it's those that pay tax and or VAT. And then the third sector is in grey. That is the informal sector, and that represents those businesses or individuals that are not registered, so don't pay tax or VAT, which is a lot of the informal workers in that market. And then the fourth, which isn't represented in the diagram, that is the non-corporate sector, which ultimately is everything that isn't in white, so everything that's not within the corporate sector. And that's, the data for the non-corporate sector is less covered explicitly.
Okay. And then who determines, when it comes to assessing the claimant, who determines what sector the claimant must fall in?
So ultimately, ideally, that should be factual. So if somebody is in the employment market, it should be known what sector they are employed in. However, if, based on future where there's unknown, or if it's a younger claimant, it's ultimately in the IP's realm to make that prediction. So it's very much their responsibility to get an understanding of, in order to project the uninjured and injured incomes, they need to take into account various factors of the claimant, such as their skill level, education level, to put out an earnings amount or career projection. And one of the important factors to get to that figure or earnings figure or figures is to understand what employment sector they are likely to work in, because it does have an implication. So by way of an example, if you have the role of a cleaner working in a big corporate will earn a lot more typically than a cleaner working in a small SMME versus a cleaner working very informally. Even though their role might be the same or their job title might be the same, the earnings associated will differ quite drastically.
Yeah.
That's where it becomes important.
Hi, my name is Rowan. I am a trustee of the Kamvalethu Foundation. I'm not sure if you're aware that together with Munro Forensic Actuaries, you as our client are making a contribution to the education of children in under-resourced areas. For every report that you instruct us on, we give a contribution to Kamvalethu, who supports our project partners in these areas. But you can go even further by making a donation. If you go to our website, munrofa.com, and click on the Giving Back tab, you will find more information. Thank you for your support. Okay, so this is clearly within the domain of the industrial psychologist, within your domain as an earnings specialist.
Yeah.
Where does the data for these different sectors come from? I know that we've already spoken about the corporate sector being covered by big companies like Deloitte and PE Corporate. Where does the rest of the data come from? And what is our impression of that data? You'll probably go into that as well.
Yeah. So as mentioned as seen in the diagram, the corporate sector accounts for roughly 25% of the working population. So the other sectors covers a large cohort of the working population, including the public or government sector. So earnings information on the public sector is somewhat readily available. They publish their notches and the increases per working category. Those are available publicly. Sometimes not as easy as what one ideally would want to have. So that forms part of the formal sector. Like some information is available. Getting into the more informal or the wider, the rest of the working population, Stats SA is one of the biggest providers or earnings collector of information, and that covers the larger working population, and they do their national census every 10 years. Some of the flaws with the Stats SA data are that it works on reported information. So as opposed to the more scientific approach in the corporate sector, where you have HR specialists working on the information and dissecting that. The national census relies on people reporting their income, and therefore there are obviously inconsistencies in there. And the grading and how it's represented is usually by level of education, at least in our industry. The status A information gets represented by level of education as opposed to skill level, which is commonly used in the corporate sector surveys.
And I've heard of, when we talk about this idea of a Paterson job grading system, how does that fit within what you've just said around the corporate and then the Stats SA?
Yeah, so the Paterson job grading system is used in vocational theory, and it's effectively just a way in which one can differentiate between the skill level required per job type. And there are a few elements that go into it, but the Paterson system works on a grading, tiering, either from level A to B all the way down to E. And as you go down the list, the job or the roles therein are differentiated by work complexity, responsibility, working conditions, and skill requirements. So it's just it's an easy way to try and categorize the demands of different positions, and they have then associated various pay bands as one goes up or down the grading list.
So Julie, maybe I can bring you in here. You as an actuary now will receive this information in a report from an industrial psychologist and earnings specialist. What is it that you encounter when an IP uses, for example, the corporate sector earnings to earnings, for example, from a StatsA or some other from other source?
So one of the big things that we do see is that we get a lot of corporate survey projections. And part of that, I think, is what Dean was saying, due to the availability of that corporate survey data. So we find sometimes the analysis of the sector is not done in sufficient detail, but the corporate figures are almost used as a default because they're readily available, rather than saying, this person definitely will work in the corporate sector and therefore those are the appropriate earnings to use. So, that's a common trend that we see, that there's much larger than the 25% of the population that works in that. We see a majority of cases being proposed in the corporate sector.
And from an attorney's point of view, what is the risk there for the attorney?
So I think the risk is that there's more awareness of that nowadays. So the greater awareness means that, for example, if a RAF is aware of it and they spot that, okay, this person actually isn't someone that would work in the corporate sector and the corporate sector earnings have been proposed, the risk is that there may be delays or less inclination to settle a claim because there's a reason that RAF sees as valid for delaying it or for actually litigating against it. And also within the court system, if judges also take that sector on and question, is it appropriate that the corporate sector has been applied, it could also lead to delays in the claim or, bigger penalties or contingencies being put on, or just an overall reduction in the claim. And I think it just makes the whole claims process less efficient because there's more uncertainty and more questions being asked about it. So I think that's a risk for the attorney.
And how have the courts approached this?
Well, interesting. There's actually two rulings. I'm sure there's more, but two that we're aware of. The first was in 2019, Chazi versus RAF, where there was a plaintiff and a defendant industrial psychologist that were both testifying, and their proposals were pretty much the same except for the surveys that they used. So the plaintiff IP was using a corporate sector survey, whereas the defendant's IP was using Stats SA figures by education level. And that gave quite different answers. And then obviously in their testimony, they went into the pros and cons of the different surveys. And I think this claimant in particular wasn't going to work in the corporate sector, or it could be argued that it wasn't the appropriate sector. However, the judge still ruled that the corporate sector earnings should be used. The main reason for that is because of the reliability of those surveys as opposed to the Stats SA. But the judge then put a higher contingency on to allow for the fact that the earnings were probably too high for that claimant. And then we saw a similar ruling actually just in the last 2 weeks. It was on behalf of a minor. I think it's VAM on behalf of TM versus RAF. And the same thing, it was again two industrials, again corporate on the plaintiff side and a stats SA by education level on the defendant side, and the same ruling by the judge. The judge did say, the usefulness of the stats SA figures is that it highlights that the general population's earnings are lower than corporate, so they took that from it, but then used the corporate figures with a percentage reduction. So yeah, it's been an interesting trend we've seen.
So as a simple lawyer like me looks at all these technical sectors and the application of them to different people, can you maybe dumb it down for us a little bit, or me at least? Can you give me some sort of practical example of how using a corporate sector as opposed to some other sector earnings would impact a claim?
Yeah, sure. So there was a claim we did quite recently where we did consider both sides. So just in a nutshell, the claimant is currently, I think, 9 years old. And the uninjured career progression was that she would have got a degree. And in the injured, it's now a certificate level. So we use just sort of very standard assumptions using Paterson level from one of the corporate surveys versus Stats SA by education level. And on the corporate side, the loss came to about 4 million, whereas using Stats SA figures, the loss came to about 2.5 million. So it's a 1.5 million rand difference, which is quite significant. And to get to that 2.5 million claim by using corporate figures, the contingency that would have to be applied is around 40%. Okay, interestingly, that percentage corresponds with some of the percentages shown in the Quantum Yearbook. So recently they've added a table that gives you percentages that could be used to convert corporate figures to general population figures. So it's not used often, but that percentage and that amount of 40% is not that different to some of the percentages shown in that table.
Thanks, Julie. That's a big difference, and it shows how important it is to consider the employment sector that the claimant is in. As an earnings specialist, would you agree with that, Dean?
Yeah, I agree completely. And that just reiterates the importance of the IP, taking into account what the likeliest sector that the claimant would be working in or is currently working in, and then using or choosing the appropriate survey to predict their earnings associated with each job.
And Julie, the attorney, why is this important to attorney? Because it sounds pretty technical at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's just an encouragement for attorneys to engage with their IPs, because ultimately it affects the attorney and the litigation and how smoothly or efficiently the process goes. So I think our point is that we've seen hiccups when things have maybe not been appropriate or not appropriately considered and motivated. So I think it's in the attorney's interest to engage with the IPs to make sure the sector has been appropriately considered, motivated for, and I think the whole claim settlement process will just go more efficiently. So I think, that's why it's in their interest.
Right. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Dean, for your time. I hope that you as the viewer have got a greater understanding of the importance of considering the employment sector that your claimant is in, and that you're talking to your IP about these issues. We've mentioned a couple of court cases in this pod shot. It will be in the citations below so that you can track it online. But thank you for your time, and I hope to see you for our third pod shot series later in the year.